So what I'd like to think about this morning is the theme of carrying things, of what we carry, what weight we bear, which is, I think, crucial certainly to the gospel story. Now, a little bit of context about the gospel passage we've heard. If you think it was a rather long passage, you're right. It's the longest dialogue that Jesus has with anyone in the New Testament. The disciples, during his trial. This is the central, longest conversation that Jesus has in the Christian Testament. So clearly, for John, it's a crucial conversation. And a couple things about that conversation. First of all, a reminder that when John says that Samaritans and Jews did not hold things in common, that's the understatement of all time. They loathed each other. So much so that a faithful Jew, if he saw a Samaritan coming towards him, would cross the street so as not to get anywhere near the enemy. So the background for this is that the hearers of the gospel will have this Samaritan tradition in front of them and the history of the enmity and the hatred between the two groups. It is worth noting that the time that John's gospel is written, the last gospel to be written, much later than the others, the temple in Jerusalem has already been destroyed. So John is writing in the context of the fact that there is no longer any worship in Jerusalem. So in a funny way, the Samaritans are more on the mark because there's no longer the temple, which was the center of religion for the Jews. So there's this context, this history, if you will, this burden of hostility between these two groups. But I want to think about what we carry and the weight of what we carry for a moment. Now, I'll put this in the context of my own life and my experience. My great friend, Anna Pearson, who I've talked about many times, who's the rector of Holy Apostles in New York City and Chelsea, is getting a 3-month sabbatical. Now, that's not a hint. It's just a fact. She's going on this wonderful 3-month sabbatical. And she would tell me about the sabbatical, and I wondered why I couldn't retain the itinerary and what she was doing. And I'll tell you why. I finally realized, because it makes no sense to me. She is going on a 2-month bike ride across the United States. She's going to, with a group of 50 other women, it's a well-organized tour. She's going to dip herself into the Pacific Ocean in San Diego, and 2 months later, she's going to dip herself into the Atlantic Ocean in St. Augustine, and then come home. And then she goes on that walk in Spain, St. James's Walk, and that's a month of walking. And I said to Anna over one of our lunches to talk about this, I said, I don't understand anything you're saying to me. My idea of biking across the United States is just not comprehensible for me. And then she had to crown it by saying, and we've got a 50-pound limit into what we can bring. And I had no idea. I'll tell you a quick story from my childhood. My parents, one time, we were going to Williamsburg on a family vacation, and we had, as many had, the gigantic Buick station wagon from the 1960s. And my parents said to my brother and I, we're going to let you, we were perhaps 7 or 8, said, we're going to let you pack what you want to bring. Very dangerous thing to say to me. And my parents loved telling the story of bringing the bags out to the car and finding that I had decorated the back of the station wagon with little folding tables and, books and little shelves, and they should have known what they were up against. So for me, I said to Anna, I think my loafers weigh more than 50 pounds. I can't imagine how for 2 months that's all you're going to have. But anyway, when it came time to say goodbye, I was really bereft because I speak to her almost every day. And it's going to be much different for the next 2 months. So what I decided was that I would pray for her every morning, but I wanted to anchor it in knowing where she was. So I ordered an 8-foot map of the United States, and I'm marking each. I have her itinerary, if you're interested. It's 4 pages here, which gives the place that she'll spend the night, the miles that she's traveled, and the height of altitude of where she is as well. She goes at one point in Arizona over 7,000 feet above sea level, and that has to be uphill at some point. So marking where she is, I'm thinking about her, and I'm thinking that I hope if she gets, it's an organized tour, but I hope that when she's thirsty that someone offers her a drink. I hope that she's safe, and I hope that she has a really wonderful experience. Another friend of hers said, the greatest gift I can give you on this trip is not to give you a journal to carry. You can just keep it inside of you. And the idea of carrying worry or concern, as friends do for each other, is something that I think is deeply embedded in the gospel story today. We have the story of a woman who has a burden, a great weight to carry, and that is water, first of all. She is, as women were in the first century of the Common Era, were the people who were charged with getting the fresh water for the family's needs from a well. And the time, of course, to do that was early in the morning when it was cooler. But people who had been ostracized from the community went later in the day, much less comfortable, but they were pushed out of the earlier time, and so being there at noon says this is someone outside of the accepted community of the Samaritans. And we're soon to find out why. But it is wonderfully lodged in physical weight. A few years ago on a conference that was raising money for freshwater wells being developed in Africa, where women still carry water each day for the family's needs. And wells within communities for fresh, safe water would be an incredible improvement on their daily lives. And part of the conference was that we were asked to carry what they carry, which is a 5-gallon pail of water, not as far as they often have to carry it, but for 1 mile. And I have to tell you, after the first 100 feet, I was ready to dive, without ever drinking again. A 5-gallon bucket of water is very heavy. So this woman is carrying the burden of water. And what happens is really interesting, and I always love to point this out. I know there are very few big laughs in the Bible, but this is a humorous passage. And what's humorous is the banter between Jesus and the Samaritan woman. She is taken by surprise that a faithful Jew, first of all, is in Samaria, and second of all, at her well, and asks for something from the Samaritan woman, which was strictly prohibited. And so she engages in conversation with him. And Jesus knows about her, which is the thing that astounds her. And there's the very funny moment when she says, I have no husband. And he says, indeed, you have no husband. And the person you're with now is not your husband. And you've had 5 before him. And she sarcastically says, I see you are a prophet. It's meant to show banter, but also engagement in conversation, in this dialogue that's so important to John's gospel. And in that banter and in that conversation, the woman reveals what she has been carrying, not just physically, but spiritually. She's been carrying a number of things that weigh her down. First of all, the role of women in the first century of the Common Era, tasked with the difficult work of survival of the family, without recognition or honor or place in society. She also carries her identity as a Samaritan, dismissed and despised by the traditional Jewish community. She also carries guilt, perhaps, over her many relationships and the fact that she is not living with someone that she's married to now. And all of those things seem to be a weight, a burden that she is carrying, that Jesus addresses. There's also, interestingly, the weight, the burden of the religious tradition that she carries, because she tries to get Jesus to enter in the debate about Samaritans versus Jews. And Jesus bypasses it and says, I'm not here to talk to you about this. I'm here to talk to you about you. And what happens is the woman realizes that Jesus has truly seen her and understood her. And that profoundly changes her life forever. She becomes an evangelist, if you will, back to the Samaritans. And she goes back and she says, I met this man who knew all about me, who told me everything I'd ever done. He must be the Messiah, isn't he? And they go to see for themselves. So much so that eventually they say, it's not just because you told us about this guy, but we have experienced him as well. And I think the life change that happens to the woman is that she's able to unburden herself of the weight of what she carried before. It's underscored by the simple line, she left her container of water behind her. She was no longer going to carry water. She was no longer going to struggle with the burdens that she had. And she had been freed up by recognizing Jesus as the Messiah to a new way of being. And instead of a burden, she's carrying something else. She's carrying her experience to her community of this remarkable man that she's met. And now she's carrying hope to look for the future, to the coming of the Messiah. Her life is changed by 180 degrees in this conversation with Jesus. And I think the message for us is to ask ourselves, what weighs us down? What worries, anxieties, what grief or sadness, what old wounds that we carry burden us? And are we open to Jesus taking those burdens from us and opening to us a greater life of freedom and hope? I think the reason that this passage is chosen for this Sunday in Lent is it's an invitation to let go of things that hold us down, hold us back, overwhelm us. And we don't do it easily or simply or superficially, but we do it profoundly through community. To me, it signifies as being so important that she goes back to her community, and together they discover who Jesus is. And isn't that true for all of us? So my prayer this Sunday in Lent is that we too might hear the word of Christ and find it to be a word of liberation, of freedom, of hope, in a life that we can live now being closer to God and closer to one another. Amen.